Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see you, and thank you for coming to this particular panel conversation. I'm Joel Green, and I'm the provost of the seminary. I'm also the dean of the School of Theology, but I'm just going to wear my provost hat today while I interrogate my colleagues to your right and my left. So David Downs is the Associate Dean for the Center for Advanced Theological Studies, which is in the School of Theology, and so he's standing in for the Dean of the School of Theology this morning. Mary Clements, the Dean of the School of Psychology, and Scott Sundquist, the Dean of the School of Intercultural Studies. So here's our panel, and what I'd like for them to do is to say hello to you and then say a word about why you came to Fuller. So shall we start with you, David?
Sure. Good morning. Welcome. I think it'd be much more enjoyable if Joel Green, the provost, asked Joel Green, the dean of School of Theology, questions. Then I could leave and you could be more entertained. Happy to be here and meeting you all during this welcome week. I came to Fuller in 1999, just after I graduated from college. So I came as an MDiv student, and I was here from 1999 till 2002. And then I came back and joined the faculty in 2007 after having completed my PhD. There is a story about why I came to Fuller initially as a student that I sometimes, I almost always tell it to my intro New Testament classes, and I'll give you the abbreviated version now, and if you ever have a class with me, you might hear the longer version. But basically, when I was a freshman in college at Clemson University in South Carolina, having been raised in a fairly conservative evangelical church and family, I had something of a crisis of faith when I took Intro to New Testament my freshman year, and I started learning critical and hard things about the Bible that kind of shocked me and seemed inconceivable. So as a result of that experience, crisis, moment of difficulty, my dad, who had gone to seminary, FedExed me a set of books that he thought might be helpful for me as I wrestled with some of the questions. One of which was a book called The New Testament and Criticism by George Eldon Ladd, which is a name that you may hear sometimes here at Fuller, because Ladd was a very important figure in the early years of Fuller Seminary. And my colleague in New Testament, Mary Ann Mai Thompson, holds the George Eldon Ladd Chair in New Testament. So in that book, Ladd tries to wrestle with the question how it's possible to hold the commitment that the Bible is the Word of God, while at the same time that the Bible is the Word of God mediated to us through human hands. So it's the Word of human beings and the Word of God at the same time. And that was really crucial for me as I wrestled with some of these questions in college as an 18-year-old. And I remember looking at the dust jacket of the book at the back of it and seeing that George Ladd was professor of New Testament at Fuller, and thinking, if I ever go to seminary, that Fuller Seminary wouldn't be a bad place to end up. So a few years later, when I was applying to graduate schools, I applied to Fuller. I came here, I did my master's degree, and then I was delighted to come back as a faculty member.
If Joel followed David's suggestion, I would have something to do, as I would work with Dr. Green, having this where he was responding to voices. Unlike my colleagues, my education was entirely secular. So I did my undergraduate work at Yale, my graduate work at the University of Denver. I then went on to take a faculty position at Penn State. When I decided to leave Penn State, I wanted to leave to go someplace where I would have students who were equally passionate, equally committed, equally called to what they were doing in terms of psychology, but I didn't want to be in that sort of environment anymore. I wanted to be at a place where my faith was respected, my commitments to my families were respected, so on and so forth. And so I applied to a million different places, including Fuller, and I didn't actually know what I was doing when I applied to Fuller. Didn't actually know what Fuller was because, as you probably know, there are a lot of Christian schools out there that are Christian on a whole level of dimensions, right? So there are Christian schools like Yale that started. Did you know that Yale started because Harvard was becoming too liberal, right? This is not a criticism that they would make now, right? Or that anybody would make of Yale. So anyway, so there are schools that started out Christian and have Christian in their title or in their tradition. And what does that really mean? I quickly found out what that meant for Fuller, and that was a lovely fit for me. So I've been here since 2001. I started as a faculty member. I became the chair of the department of what was clinical psychology and now is doctoral psychology, because we now have a non-clinical degree as well. And then I became dean about 3 years ago.
My name is Scott Sundquist, and I was actually offered a job at Fuller in 1993 and turned it down because I was a missionary. And at that time, did you know this, Joel?
I did.
There were 20 people teaching mission at Fuller, but there was nobody teaching mission at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and I was enough of a missionary to figure that that's a mission field. So I taught for 17 years at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary as the only mission person. And it was an uphill battle. Most of the faculty were embarrassed that I was there. Many people are embarrassed that I'm here. I don't know about that. But because I represented mission, and they just thought mission was imperialism, it was Western imposition of our ideals on the rest of the world. And so it was a real struggle for 17 years. There were about 4 or 5 faculty that were very supportive, wonderful friends that I still have. So when it came up an opportunity to come here, I was ready to come. And to build on my scholarship and teaching in the area of mission now, to work with a lot of missionaries at what I consider one of the places in the world where we deal with missional issues for the global church. And so it's been a great joy to be here after 17 years in Western Pennsylvania, where it rains a lot.
Thank you. I'm not at all tempted to talk to myself after those comments, but let me call your attention to the fact that there are 2 microphones, one on each side. At any time, feel free to get up and go to a mic, and I'll call on you, and you can ask a question of any of our panelists. But let me first ask them another question, and if you don't mind, Scott, start with you this time. What would you say the challenges and significance would be in being in a 3-school seminary? Fuller's a strange animal in this respect, with a school of psychology, intercultural studies, and theology. What difference does that make, and what's the significance of that? What are the challenges of that?
I can't think of anything negative about that. I must say it's been one of the greatest joys for me to begin thinking more about the social sciences in mission, because I'm a natural school of theology person. I went to a school named Princeton that was started because Yale got too liberal. So they started Princeton, and then Fuller started because, well, you know where it goes. And so to be in a school of theology is where I belong. I did a history degree. I did my biblical languages, and then Syriac to do historical work. And so to come in a school of intercultural studies, where we do a lot more with anthropology and sociology and even psychology, has been a joy. The integration lectures are just phenomenal here. You have people that deal with psychological subjects, and then we critique it in terms of theology and other cultures. It's just a remarkable place to be. I mean, we had a theology exam of a future faculty member here who is Korean Canadian, 1.5. And she majored in Russian linguistics in college, and then she worked in Kazakhstan. And so we have that kind of creative faculty here who have tremendous discussions with other schools and other perspectives. The only negative thing that I can think about this is I just don't have enough time to read some of these other books from the other schools. But I would hope and pray that you take advantage of lectures, special lectureships along the way in the other schools, because there's really nowhere else in the world that you have this kind of opportunity.
Thank you, Scott. Mary?
The School of Psychology is special. I get to say that about 1 million times. But it is Special because it's here. Out on our courtyard, Travis Auditorium is actually part of the School of Psychology, so welcome to SOP. Out in our courtyard just outside, you'll see a sculpture that is the cross in the heart of a psi, the Greek letter psi, which of course, psychology. And the whole reason that Fuller's School of Psychology came to exist is so that we could have people who were taking very seriously their faith, very seriously theological and missiological truth, and very seriously psychology. So we are APA accredited, and that's very precious to us. But it's also very precious to us to be in a seminary, to be in a place where our students, are learning theology from world-class theologians, are wrestling with really hard questions and really important theological as well as psychological questions. So that's an amazing thing. I will add an additional plug to the lectureships because it's a great way to see what other things are happening. Each of the schools has one. So there's the missiological lectures, there's the Peyton lectures, which is the School of Theology lectures, and then there are integration lectures, which are every winter quarter. This year it is Stephen Sandage, and it's actually going to be truly, truly fabulous.
So you might have noticed that Joel asked a question about the challenges, but both Scott and Mary said everything was fabulous and wonderful, which it is. So I don't disagree. But I will say something about some of the challenges. And I'll do so with a bit of historical perspective. When I was a student here at Fuller, they used to have something called Fuller Follies, which if you ever get involved in student government, I would say should happen again because it was a chance for students to make fun of the professors and make fun of each other. It was a really fun event. And I vividly remember it was in this room, in fact, that they had Fuller Follies, and one of the skits was a video presentation, and it featured students from what at that time was called School of World Mission. Now it's School of Intercultural Studies. Students from the School of World Mission were getting ready for a mission trip, and it showed them like doing all of their diligent preparation, their cross-cultural training, their biblical study, their packing. They were getting all ready for the trip. And then they get the person who was leading the trip said, okay, it's time to go. So they put on their backpacks and they processed on the video across campus to the second floor of Peyton Hall, which is where the School of Theology faculty members have their offices. And they proceeded to evangelize and share the gospel with the SOT faculty. And it did work. So there's a long history behind like what made that funny, and part of it is that there was a lot of tension between SWM and SOT back in those days and even before that. And the old belief among the School of Theology was those are just missionaries. They don't do any serious theological reflection. They're just only practical. They don't do any good academic work. And among the SWIM faculty, it was they're just dead theologians in the SOT. All they read is dead white guys. They don't care about things that are happening in the church, things that are happening around the world. And it was funny because, in point of fact, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a truth to that. We live in a totally different world now in terms of the relationships among the schools. So as Scott said, Scott could just as easily be in SOT. We have people in SOT who have been missionaries. My family has lived in East Africa for 6 months a year from 2009 to 2015. So there's a lot more overlap, especially between SIS and SOT. One of the challenges for me, frankly, is I do agree with Mary that SOP is special. So I don't have any formal psychological training. In college, I never even took a class in psychology.
We can fix that.
And Mary's backing that up because she's actually doing her master's degree in the School of Theology. The dean is doing a master's degree. So I probably should follow her example. So there are some challenges in terms of, but it's a good thing. I like in my classes when students push me, when students in SOP say, how does this apply to my context in a therapy setting? And oftentimes my answer is, I don't know. What do you think? And so those conversations often bear a lot of fruit in terms of helping me learn and also helping the students learn at the same time.
Good, thank you. Let me remind you there are microphones if you have questions or want to raise your hand and move to one. Seeing none, I'll keep asking questions. So talk about your expectations of students at Fuller Seminary. Mary, we'll start with you.
See, here I was thinking I'm in the middle and I'll never have to start, and won't that be great? Okay, yes, I'm special. The way we can talk later. The way I think about expectations for students at Fuller is actually drawn from the New Testament, and that is about the idea of everything that you do as unto the Lord. It's a pretty tall order. So what is it that you're doing in my school as you're preparing to become a therapist, or if you're preparing to become an educator in the field of psychology? And what does it mean to do something not for a grade, but as unto the Lord? What does it mean to be thinking about the assignments and the readings that you're working on as things not to be checked off, but as things that are formative to you as a Christian who is studying to become a psychologist, a marriage and family therapist, or a Christian educator? So what is that like? What does that mean? And I think that expectation can be hard to live up to. There's no question but what graduate school is not like undergraduate. It's not like anything you've had before. I mean, I routinely have students come in and they're like, oh, I used to take 6 classes a term as an undergrad. What is this 3? This is nothing. And then they see, oh, no, in fact, it is something. So we give you these things with all these levels of expectations, and when you master that, we throw you something else. So you get all these new classes and you're learning all these new skills, and once you've got that, we put you in the room with a live client. And once you've figured out how to do a live client, then we say, oh, and you're supposed to start on your master's or your doctoral research, so we throw you that. And once you're handling those, then we say, okay, so you're handling the one client, now we'd like you to see 3 or 4 a week. And so we keep throwing more and more things at people until, if you knew in your first year what you were going to be doing at the end of your program, you might run screaming out of the auditorium. But the truth is that it's like learning to juggle. You juggle one, and then you get a second one, and then a third, a fourth, a fifth ball as you're going along. Now, that's the lousy example for me because I can't juggle even one, but you get the idea, right? The idea is that in each step of the program, we have a very cohort-based, very sequential set of programs, but that in each step of the way, we're really training you to meet the next challenge, to take the next step. And that's an exhilarating, but also challenging journey.
It's a difficult question to ask in some ways, to answer in some ways, because students are different. Students come from very different contexts. Students themselves have very different expectations. And I guess maybe that's part of how I would answer, which is to say, be ready to be surprised by people in your classes who are very different from you, who have a very different set of commitments, very different set of experiences. One of the things that I love about teaching at Fuller is that it's a very diverse place. And in the classroom, that often manifests itself in terms of people disagreeing with one another, people sharing different experiences. Hopefully we do that in our classes here with a spirit of charity and compassion and understanding and empathy, and really a desire to want to learn from the experience of others. So I would say that would be an expectation that you should expect to be challenged by your classmates, by your professors, by your readings. We were at the this last week. There was a employee gathering, all faculty and staff, and Steve Smith, who's the director of admissions, whom you may have met in your journey here to Fuller, got up and shared a little bit about his experience as a student. And he put it in a way that I just sort of captured, it just caught my attention. He was talking about the first class he took here at Fuller. It was a class on ethnicity and culture, I think he said. And he read a book that was particularly challenging, and the class was very challenging. And he said, the class broke my brain. And I thought, that probably happens a lot to students at Fuller.
Have we hired this guy? You get a broken brain.
So it was sort of a vivid way to describe, I think, sometimes what you should expect to happen in class. You go in with a certain understanding, a certain way of thinking, a certain set of experiences and you read stuff or you encounter people or you have experiences or you're forced to do assignments that just break your brain. And sometimes that can be hard because then you just get through that experience in 10 weeks and you turn around and then you have to do it again with another set of classes. This is the challenge of the quarter system in some ways. So it can be difficult, but stick with it. And you'll find, I think, as Mary said, that in your second year and third year, you'll look back on those previous experiences with a sense of accomplishment, we hope, but also a sense of relief, knowing that you wrestled with those challenges and that sort of set you up to wrestle with other challenges in your other classes.
Those are great answers. I'm not sure my answer is so great, but it's two parts. One is many of you have come from a more conservative background than you will find here. And you'll say, wow, Fuller's liberal. Others of you have come from the Presbyterian Church USA, and you think, wow, Fuller's conservative. And some of you will come from a more liturgical background and say, wow, Fuller's worship service, there's no liturgy at all. And so I think one of my expectations is that you will experience the great joy of the whole church at Fuller. And that means in your reading of theology, in your reading of the Bible, in your connection with other people, that you'll understand Orthodox brothers and sisters as really Christians who love Jesus, and Roman Catholics and different religious orders, as well as Pentecostals. And you'll come out the kind of Christian that wherever you go in the world, you're comfortable with Christians and not just your own, tribe or, background. I came to that conclusion very personally when our daughter and son-in-law converted to Orthodoxy last year, Syrian Orthodox in Philadelphia. And that was hard for me because they really can't be Presbyterian missionaries now. They were sort of preparing for that. And so we go to worship with them, and there's great tradition in the Orthodox tradition of spirituality. I read every day from the Philokalia, which are a collection of writings that go back to the early church for my own, discipline. It's wonderful for me. So I hope that you'll be able to benefit from that. I hired a Pentecostal guy to lead our PhD program. And we just had this very sort of Pentecostal kind of presentation about being a PhD student and listening to the Holy Spirit and so forth. So I that would be one of my expectations. The second expectation is a story I told at the 50th anniversary celebration. And I told it about our SIS graduates, but I really mean it for all of our Fuller graduates. I would hope that this would be what happens. Somebody's traveling in Madagascar. And they come to a village, and here's this, it could be Korean, Hispanic, white person who clearly doesn't belong in that area. And they observe that they speak the local language. They observe that when they come to this worship service, they're attentive to this little child, and they go over and talk to the little child. They observe that they help an elderly person into the pew, and they say, this is a really amazing person. They don't belong here, but they're very aware of what's going on around. And then they are involved in a prayer meeting before the worship over there. And then they're able to help some other people out at the end of the service. And you go up and you say, who are you? Where are you from? And then they say, oh, you must be a Fuller graduate, because I saw the way you behave and how you're attentive to others. You must have gone to Fuller. So that would be one of my expectations, that all of our graduates come out as people who are gentle, servants, and attentive, and really smart. And we don't see that that's a dichotomy, that it's all a part of the same thing, growing in our knowledge and in our humility together. So.
Thank you, Scott. Actually, the thing that Scott was just talking about is one of the things that attracted me to Fuller. I came in 2007 and started teaching in 2008. I had been in another seminary, I'll call it Seminary X, for 10 years before that. And this was it was another tradition, relatively narrowly circumscribed. And this tradition, or this particular seminary, would look at a place like Wheaton or at Fuller and say, well, they used to be okay, but then and then they became too Calvinist, or then they left the Armenian faith or whatever. And I just thought the future of God's work in the world was not going to be tied so carefully to a particular Christian tradition or to a particular church. In fact, David, you were Episcopalian until recently. Were you raised Episcopalian?
No, I was raised Baptist General Conference.
The microphone's right there.
Baptist
General Conference. And now you're
Free Methodist, but I was also a Presbyterian in the middle.
so he's like Fuller, all in one person.
Well, I think you need to add me.
Oh, I'm coming to you.
Okay.
So David represents one journey. Mary, a very different journey.
Yes. My background is Independent Christian Church, and that's a term I didn't even know until I got to Fuller, because we just call ourselves Christians. So I'm part of an obscure sort of movement within the Christian tradition. We call ourselves the Restoration Movement, so the 1850s Stone Campbell sort of piece. Again, those are things that not necessarily I knew the Stone Campbell part, but I wouldn't necessarily have put it in that context because that's just the water that I swam in my whole life. And so being at Fuller, where we have this mix of, Scott says there's no liturgy, and yesterday during the Welcome Week worship service, I pointed out two things that I'd never encountered until I came to Fuller: the passing of the peace and the sort of ritualistic when you say the word of the Lord, thanks be to God, those kinds of things. That's not part of my tradition, and it's actually very lovely to be able to see the whole tapestry of evangelical Christian traditions, both current and also in your history classes and other experiences across the centuries, and knowing that you're part of this larger story that has incredible richness and incredible diversity is just an amazing gift of Fuller.
And Scott, are you like once Presbyterian, always Presbyterian?
It's God's will.
Yeah. But I mentioned one daughter became Orthodox and another one is a Vineyard Church, and then I have a son who goes to Tim Keller's church, and then another son who goes to a Bible church. And so we're like Fuller as a family.
It's the Fuller family for Thanksgiving.
Fuller House.
And so I'm Fuller House. Okay. There's a song about that, right?
TV program.
Okay. So I'm Methodist, and so here we are, the four of us, representing quite different traditions. Until recently, that is, when David became a Free Methodist. I'm a United Methodist. You may know United Methodists aren't very united right now, and some of us don't think the Free Methodists are very free, but we're still out of the same trunk of the tree. The fun thing about Fuller in that respect is that it's not simply homogeneous, lowest common denominator faith. I bring who I am, my tradition, my background with me wherever I go, and that's okay. And Mary brings her background, which she thought was the only background, with her, and that's okay. And likewise, PCUSA. And I actually don't know what to say, David, about your background. Baptist, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Free Methodist.
Sometimes when people ask me what my denomination is, I think evangelical, or my denomination is Fuller in some sense.
We're not just non-denominational, we're anti-denominational. So it's really weird.
Yeah, very good. So that's another part of Fuller. Let me remind you, there are microphones on both sides.
Please,
if you
come
have
ask questions.
They may get tired of me asking questions before this is finished, so feel free to raise questions yourself if you like. Oh, good, yes.
Morning. My name is Young. I'm Korean. I'm beginning the practical theology in CATS. When I was also I had a class with Dr. Sundquist and evangelism. Now, when I applied for pursuing PhD program, I was always had some conflict, because I was a missionary in Venezuela, and so my interest was always, in the mission, cross-cultural mission. Also, because I was in School of Theology, and also I loved, study theology and together. So I applied to practical theology. So, but I'm pursuing, also mission in part of practical theology. So I wanna really know. Also, I had a orientation yesterday with David. I wanna hear about how much I can expect integration and some cooperation between School of Theology, School of Intercultural Study together, and when I want to study more missiology based on practical theology.
Mm-hmm.
So it's my question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
David, do you want to address that?
Sure.
Just make up an answer.
Well, this doesn't apply directly to you, Young, because you're in the THM program, but you all will know at the master's level, with the MDiv, MAICS, MAT degrees, there's a lot more integration curricularly than there had been in the past. And so a couple of years ago, the faculty got together and worked on that, and that's, I think, some of the fruit of the change that I talked about that has happened since I was a student here. So curricularly, there's a significant degree of overlap. Within CATS, as we sort of talked about yesterday, for example, in the THM, we're working on, I've had several meetings with Amos Young, who directs the THM program for CATS, in the last couple of weeks, about bringing the THM programs together under a common set of program learning outcomes and a common curricular structure. So there are structural things that are happening that are bringing SIS and SOT together at THM level, hopefully at the doctoral level as well. But related to what Scott said earlier, I think, I hope you will find that the people you work with in SOT are deeply interested in questions of mission and evangelism and intercultural communication. And similarly, the people that you may have an opportunity to work with in SIS are deeply interested in questions of theology and church history and practices of worship and those sorts of things. So I would say we're in a very exciting time here at Fuller at the master's level and at the THM and PhD levels for a great deal of collaboration between these two schools at least. Scott, I don't know if you want to.
I think it's very helpful. Let me just give you an example. My first two thesis defenses that I was on here at Fuller, one was Rebecca Geiselbrecht from Switzerland, who was doing a Reformation and Women and Cultures dissertation. It looked like a pure history thing. She was in the School of Intercultural Studies. So it was John Thompson and myself were guiding her in that dissertation. The second was Jimmy Tan from Singapore, who wanted to do a spirituality for missionaries, and he was tracing the Jesuits in the Reformation period. And he had somebody from the School of Psychology, School of Theology, and myself in that defense. So it is quite possible. We work pretty closely together now, and I think that we see a lot more. I'm going to be doing a seminar on missional historiography next fall, possibly, or next winter, which will be open to School of Theology PhD students as well as SIS.
And Young, I might mention that in the THM program, there's actually a good bit of flexibility, both for 800 level classes and for 500 level classes, for you to take courses in any of the three schools, if your advisor approves. Yes.
As mostly first years, I think a big thing is our goal is ultimately to become, something like you all one day. In some aspect. Well, don't take it too high. But I think my question more or less, what was one of the main influential experiences, whether a book or a mentor or something that really brought you on the track where the Lord guided you into what you're doing today?
Yeah, I can start. For me, it's very clearly I had two mentors who were just amazing. One was Nigel Kerr, a church historian who was on the board of the Latin America Mission. And his door was always open in his office, and he loved coffee and donuts. And so he was willing to talk about Puritans. He was a Puritan historian all the time. He was open to discussion about it, constantly reading, and that completely changed the way I viewed ministry and academics. The second was my mentor at Princeton, Sam Moffett. I would come over to his house he would read a chapter or something I was working on, and I had at that time 4 kids, so I'd bring a couple of them over, and Eileen would take them in the kitchen and cut up an apple for them. I'd take off my shoes and slippers, go in the dining room, sit at the table, he'd go over the papers. But that modeling of commitment to me and my scholarship and prayer directed my life. So today, when a student comes in my office, I still, in a sense, have my mentor on my shoulder, speaking to me about how you treat students, how you think about scholarship and so forth. And so my whole life I've seen scholarship as a pastor and a missionary in all that I do. So I would have to say that's what really redirected my life.
My parents account for 7 unique marriages. So that is counting their marriage to each other as one of those, not counting it for my dad and for my mom. They account for 7 unique marriages. My research is on the effects of marital conflict on children.
Make the connection.
Not very hard. Not very hard. But I was fortunate to have some very important people in my life growing up who really were points of connection. And one of those people was our senior pastor, who was also our administrative pastor, who was also our youth pastor, who was also our worship. Yeah, that's how small our church was. But this particular person, he was in his, he was finishing seminary actually while he was our pastor, and he was just an incredibly selfless person who poured himself into the lives of these kids in youth group. And it's a fascinating thing that we're now in a million different places. One's in Florida, a couple in Michigan, one state in Tennessee. I'm in California. And all 5 of us have remained, because really small church, right? All 5 of us have remained really very committed to our faith. One of us is a missionary. One of us works at a seminary. One of us is, in the leadership of the local church, and so on and so forth. And I think we can all trace it back to the care and concern and treating us seriously. Here's somebody who's in seminary and really dealing with these, the kinds of things you'll be dealing with in your courses. And he was willing to invest the time and the effort and the energy in talking with teenagers about typical teenage stuff. That some of it, I know he had to have been, oh my goodness, again, really? We're going to have this conversation again? But that sort of patience, that sort of belief in potential, that sort of belief that we were worth it was a really important modeling experience in my life that I had with a couple other people at various different levels in junior high and high school and college, but in graduate school, but really important.
It's too difficult to think about all the people who have shaped me and influenced me, but I guess I'll name 2. One is someone whom I hope and pray you will have a chance to take a class with here at Fuller, and that is Marianne Mai Thompson, who is an amazing teacher. She's just a wonderful teacher. She's a wonderful person as well. And when I was a student here at Fuller, I took a class with her. I took several classes with her, but one in particular was a class on the life of Jesus. Marianne teaches New Testament. And I was sort of a quiet student. It was a large class. I didn't say much, but I wrote a final paper. And when she read my paper, she emailed me and said, could you come to my office and talk to me? Because I think if you have any interest in going on to do further study in New Testament, I'd like to have a conversation with you about that. And I was amazed and shocked and excited to talk with her. And she then became a great supporter of me. She wrote letters of reference for me for graduate school. It so happened that she was the chair of the search committee the year that I was applying for jobs after finishing my PhD. So it worked out nicely for me, I suppose, that she encouraged me to apply for the job. So Marianne has been a very important influence in my life. The other person I'll say, and I'll try to sort of tie this into my role here and my teaching as someone who teaches New Testament, would be my wife, whom I started dating when I was 15 and she was 14. who grew up in the same church together in Delaware. And she has influenced me in so many ways, one of which is that she's always an excellent student, and I was not, in high school at least. So when I got to college and she was the valedictorian of her class, I thought I should work as hard at school as Jenny does, and maybe I would have good results. And so she's shaped me in many ways, but she's a medical doctor, and we have a challenge of balancing my career and her career. She's does clinical medical research in Tanzania, working especially on the interaction between a parasitic infection that's endemic in communities of poverty called schistosomiasis and its relationship to HIV infection. People who have schistosomiasis are 4 times more likely to be infected with the HIV virus. And in some villages, 60% or more of the population has schistosomiasis. So you can imagine how that increases the burden of disease. Anyway, so she started working in East Africa, in Tanzania, in 2008, when she was finishing up when she was doing her fellowship in infectious diseases. And I went along. I just sort of tagged along with her in 2009 when I had my first sabbatical. We spent 6 months there. This is before we had kids. We had our first child in 2010, but from 2009 to 2015, we spent 6 months a year in Tanzania. And that has been just life transforming for me, especially as a teacher, thinking about, I sometimes say that, I sort of I read all the theory about cultural hermeneutics and cultural exegesis, but it wasn't until I lived in a different cultural context that it went from like black and white to being in color and just being able to sort of really see. I started teaching. We were there. I didn't have anything to do other than sit in front of my computer and do research. I thought I should get to know people. I should make friends. So I started teaching at a Pentecostal Bible college there, and I've taught maybe 5 or 6 classes there. We still go back every summer. So that has been just transformative for me as a New Testament scholar, thinking about what it means to teach the Bible in very different contexts to students who just have very different experiences. So that has been deeply formative of me and of my scholarship and my teaching, I hope.
Someone else had a question over here? I thought I saw a hand up earlier. No? Other questions?
Clearly, Joel finds your questions more interesting than his, so please help him out.
Good morning. My name is Mary, and I'm coming from a purely psychology background. And coming into an environment like Fuller, where I've done a little bit of theology, like church theology, and I come from a liturgic background church. So I'm expecting with the deeper level theology that I'm being exposed to, or potentially being exposed to at Fuller, to have some sort of crisis in my faith. So when it comes to that, I'm not even saying if, when it comes to that, what have your experiences been in terms of dealing with it? Is there a support system? What's the platform of dealing with it? And do you have any experience with that? Thank you.
All right. I think your expectation is wise. One of the things that I make a point of noting about the School of Psychology is we are not a psychology program with a Bible study attached. That's not what we are. We're not a psychology program in the midst of a Christian fellowship. We are a psychology program that takes psychology and theology and missiology very seriously as academic disciplines, as transformative, formative disciplines, but very seriously. It is the case that you will be challenged in your theology courses because you'll hear things from my theology colleagues that you never heard from the pulpit. I mean, I'm pretty confident about that. Certainly that's been my experience. Somebody alluded to the fact that I'm 2 or 3 classes away from completing my MA in theology. And my own personal background was very conservative in terms of Christianity. And my first year on faculty, I actually, probably not by accident, got paired up with one of our colleagues who I would not call really from a very conservative background, because we have cohort classes. There are a couple of classes every year that are taken by School of Psychology students only, taught by School of Theology faculty. We used to have a School of Psychology faculty member alongside with them in each course, and so my very first 2 years I was with one of those. And one of the things that was really helpful and transformative for me, it may work for you, it may not, is knowing and seeing, because it's obvious, how much that person teaching loves and knows the same God that I do. And they may have a different perspective about it. They may have different historical views of. They may have, they may vary in terms of a variety of different things. But knowing that we're coming from the place of loving the same God and believing in the same God was a really important thing. Having said that, I would also remind all of you that Fuller is not a church, okay? And you need church. You need not to treat the fact that you're in classes reading biblical texts and reading commentaries on biblical texts and even going to chapel on Wednesday, which I strongly encourage you to do. You need to remember that's not your church. And you need a church, and you need to find a church. And there are resources available to you in finding them, but there are also, informal things. Ask somebody where they're going, where they're being fed, where they're excited about, and get connected, get involved, because you'll need the support of those people while you're wrestling with a variety of different things. It's also the case that your colleagues will often be, particularly in SOP where we have such a close cohort model in all of our programs, that your colleagues can also be helpful to you in this, because many of them will be experiencing the same things. But in the School of Psychology, we have people in all sorts of different levels of exposure to formal theological study. So we typically every year have people come in from Bible colleges or Christian colleges where some of this deconstruction and reconstruction of your faith from where you were to where you are with this degree of knowledge, with this piece of information, already happened. We have people who come in with MDivs or MATs or whatever, so they've been through some of those things and are often very generous and helpful in terms of helping you think through and how do you wrestle with this, how do you handle this. But there will also be people who are just like you, who this is their first formal exposure to theology as an academic discipline. I thought it was interesting that David pointed out that he had this crisis in Introduction to New Testament. I had, as an undergraduate, I took New Testament writings with Wayne Meeks at Yale, which was quite a wake-up call from somebody from Tennessee who was from a very conservative background. My theology colleagues are giggling at that because they know who Wayne Meeks is, but let me just say that it wasn't always obvious to me that he believed anything that was written in the Bible. Maybe that's unfair, forgive me. But those coming through those struggles is actually a really good thing. It doesn't feel good at the time, but I encourage you to remember that our God is big enough to handle any question, any doubt, any concern you have, because he is God, and he is there, and he is with you in the struggle.
I think your question is just very profound, and it's not just about seminary, it's about life. We develop images of God that are often way too small, and God is infinite. And it's really hard for us to understand what that means. And so we develop theologies that kind of help to explain so we can pass on the message. But then we come upon another culture, another experience, and so forth, and God's, oh my gosh, I have to rethink this, and our theology has to adjust. So what we're talking about is really what it means to really be a believer. And to be a believer means that when those questions come, we pray the Psalms, because the Psalms allow us to say whatever we want about God. And then God is big enough to handle that. This morning I was meditating on Psalm 61, and 5 different ways Psalm 61 talks about how God is our refuge. He's our high tower. He places upon a rock which is higher than I. He is the tent of presence. He is the mother hen who covers us with his wings. And so 5 times there in Psalm 61 that's expressed. I think a lifestyle, a theological lifestyle and spirituality that's always ready to go deeper and deeper and deeper and higher in God is what we should pray for. And it will only happen if we continue to read all of Scripture. If we're just kind of dabbling and doing our little devotions here or there among favorite things, it's not going to happen. But all of Scripture is just, it's overwhelming. I mean, I'm in Jeremiah now, and God is just really going to come down on these people. And that's a part of who God is holy. And it's hard to accept sometimes. So if we're reading all of Scripture, praying the Psalms, and in community, I mean, SOP is really good about that. A lot of our classes, our introductory classes, we talk about community. We announced yesterday an SIS, small groups, where you meet, on campus or online, are important. We don't do theology and experience these things ourselves. As we draw away and are alone, unless you're an ascetic out in the desert, I think you're moving away from where the answer is going to be. The answer is going to be found in the community where God's Holy Spirit dwells. But it's a journey that we don't go on by ourselves. But anyway, not much else.
David?
I'm not sure if I can really add anything to what Scott and Mary said. I think they both answered very helpfully.
I'd like just to underscore something that Mary said and Scott reiterated in a different way. I'm in pretty regular correspondence with 3 people from around the country that I've never met them. They have lost their faith because of some things some New Testament scholars have said. I'm thinking particularly of one who teaches in University of North Carolina. And I'm sorry?
Jen went to UNC. My wife.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. The questions never end for these people. I can talk about this. I can give reasons for this. I can give reasons for that. They never end. And so the thing that I find myself coming back to over and over again in my correspondence with them is to ask, are you embedded in a community of faith? Are you engaged in a church? Are you engaged in the practices of the Christian life? Because I'm trying to communicate with them that the way in which God reveals himself is not simply through these head issues that they're concerned about, or through proofs of Jesus' resurrection or those kinds of things, the sort of apologetic things that they're concerned about. It actually has to do with being open in my life to what God is doing and to seeing that it actually is faith at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. It actually is taking a step where you don't know where your foot's going to land. And apart from that, then all of the conversations that we have, in the end, in my view, will never get them where they want to go. Church. Other questions? Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
One question I've had, I guess in preparing, telling people that, hey, I'm thinking about going to seminary now that I am going to seminary. I didn't grow up in a Christian household or anything like that. And people, anyway, I get comments of, dude, you're really going to go to seminary? Like, I'm kind of scared for you because you're going to lose that rawness. It can't be like, we're talking it being intellectual, right? And to me, I'm pursuing this, man, just because I love Jesus. I want to get him to know him more, kind of thing. But I don't know if it's misperceptions, like of maybe people they've met in seminary and, all these types of things. I guess my point is obviously you guys have a lot of knowledge. I mean, you might not say that about yourselves, but I am going to say that about yourselves. At the end of the day, though, we're amongst a dying world that needs to connect, right, to the Lord. I'm just curious what you guys do for yourselves as, maybe as you were going through seminary. This is my first master's anything, where taking the balance of I'm getting all this knowledge, but it ain't just for me to puff me up. How are you guys? How were you? I'm just curious, like, to be at a place where it's like, hey, dude, I could still relate to you, regardless of whether I'm in seminary or not. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I guess that's just kind of my question, of just not the knowledge puffing us up and being like, dude, come to me, I'm going to give you the answers, but more like, I need to talk to the dude that's homeless on the street and be genuine about it, not just, I don't know. I'm just trying to be honest with you. Concerns that I've had, people just coming up to me like, you're going to lose your rawness or something. I'm like, I don't know. I'm just throwing that out.
I was actually told I would lose my faith if I went to cemetery, as it was called. Cemetery. Yeah. In fact, I remember I was teaching in Berkeley early on when I got out of my PhD work, and ran across a student who had come to faith in her second year in seminary. And I was just stunned. Because you're supposed to lose your faith, not get your faith at seminary. So let's hear what you have to say about this.
Well, some of what I would say has already been said, which is that I think it's crucially important during your time in seminary to be embedded in a community of faith where you're able to sort of work out some of the things you're learning in practical context, and that whatever your community of faith is committed to might look differently. For me, for example, this isn't during my time at Fuller, but when I did my PhD at Princeton Seminary, but we always lived in Manhattan because my wife was in med school then. And I don't know if you've ever been to Princeton, but it's like the perfect, idyllic, ivory tower college university town. Everything is clean and tidy and wealthy and mostly white. I mean, it's sort of like everything that academia might aspire to be. Yeah, stereotypically. I always found it such a jolting but challenging, encouraging thing to come back into Penn Station, to the sort of hustle and bustle of Manhattan. And for most of the time we lived in Harlem. And to be in that world and to be committed to our church, which was deeply engaged in ministry to homeless men and women. And so my wife and I were very much a part of that ministry. And that was life-giving for me. And sort of I needed that to balance out the kind of academics things I was learning when I was doing my graduate work. So it's very important to be plugged into a community of faith where you're able to work things out. Because in many contexts, people don't care. They're not puffed. They don't care how puffed up you might be. When you're talking with a homeless man about how he reads Romans chapter 6, he doesn't care that you have a PhD. He just wants to know what's that mean for him, and how can that help him in his attempt to get clean and to find a stable place to live. He doesn't care that you're a bright scholar or that you have a master's degree or anything. So it's forcing yourself to be in situations like that I think are important even during the time that you're studying.
I'll draw from a noted theologian, my mom, who's not at all a theologian. But when I was a little kid, my mother took me when I was very small to be tested by a psychologist who was, accruing hours for licensure, blah, 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 blah. And this person terrified my mother because she said to my mom, she's smarter than you and I will ever be. She'll never have any friends. She'll be totally maladjusted. She'll be operating up here and everybody will be down here, and it just will not be very good. And so my mom, being a good mom, was like, that's not going to happen to my kid. So she was always really straight with me. And she said, okay, so you're smart. God gave you brown eyes too. So knowledge puffing up is never really kind of my issue, because that got verbally beaten out early on. But the other response that I would have is my experience of taking theology classes has not been that they've made me feel puffed up. They've made me think deeply about things and often question what I thought I knew and why did I think I knew it, and do I still think I know this particular thing? Now, I want to draw a circle around that and say I'm not talking about faith. I'm talking about specifics of X, Y, and Z thing. That's never in question. But I've actually found it to be more humbling than puffing. So maybe your mileage may differ, but I think that our classes, when they do what they're supposed to do, are forming us to be humble people, questioning people who believe that we've got a lot to learn from everybody we run into. And if you believe that, it'll show through.
I think what we're talking about is what does it mean to be Christian in the world? I taught a course in evangelism last fall, as was mentioned, and one of the requirements was that you share your faith. It's sort of like if you're teaching surgery, at some point you need to, get out a scalpel and actually do it. And so I had a student who came to me and said, Dr. Sundquist, I don't know what to do. I said, what do you mean? She says, all my friends are Christian. I don't know anybody who's not a Christian. I said, well, you're a bad Christian. Because, in a sense, we're made for the world, That's, God sends us out, and that's why we're here, not just to sit on a shelf with other Christian idols. And so I said, find a way to meet people. And so she found a friend. She was a little scared, so they went together across there to the gas station. And as cars pulled up in the gas station, they got a cup of tea. Paul's I highly recommend this, actually. They pull up the gas station and say, hey, we're just students from Fuller Seminary, and we're here to pray for people. Is there anything you'd like us to pray for you? Nobody said no. Everybody said, oh, yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's unbelievable. And they would pray, got about 3 minutes, depending on how much gas they needed, to pray for them and send them on their way. And they began to meet some people and bring their faith out into the world. So I would say, as my pastor said in Paoli, Pennsylvania, I have to find a way to meet non-Christians, because when I go to church, everybody's sort of some kind of Christian. And so I think what will keep us honest in our faith is to find ways to connect. And I really like what you said, David. If you can't live in Harlem, live in Pasadena. The homeless are all around you. You can meet some friends here and find ways of always expressing your faith, to make sure that what you're learning in the classroom really does connect to the world. I think it does. That's why that's why I was a missionary. But I think along the way we need to make those connections and not say, okay, I'm going to do this Christian thing and now I'm going to go out. But find patterns, lifestyle patterns where you're meeting people. Thank you for the question.
That's good. We have about 5 more minutes. Yes.
Hi, my name is Ratish. I'm coming from India, and I'm one of the SIS students. Even I'm Indian, I'm coming from South Korea. I worked as a pastor in South Korea for 7 years. Then I did my MD in South Korea. My question is, I experienced studying in seminary, and I accept God 2005 in YWAM. So people told me, don't go to seminary if you don't want to lose God. Then I didn't know what they mean by that. Then I studied in Korea. It's a very competitive country. They go for grade, they go for task, they go for they don't mind much relationship. Then I was thinking, the reason I'm here not just because of the grade, the reason I'm here because of God. But my friends, they don't have time because they're competitive, because they want to have a good grade. They want to have a lot of knowledge and information. So I'm coming to Fuller. Then after my theology, I knew that I must not study anymore after my MD. Because 3 years, I had to push myself to study more. Because it gives me a lot of stress when I see my friends are studying a lot. They don't have time for fellowship, relationship, because too much to study, dealing with the Hebrew and Greek. Then I talked to my wife, I don't want to study anymore. I feel like I should going back to YWAM and work with the YWAM. Then God wanted me to study again theology, then send me to Fuller. But the question I want to make it, we need academic and information knowledge. Then again, one thing is reminding me that I'm in Fuller because of God. God is more relationship-oriented person. How do I balance with my friends? We're trying to get a more academic, Fuller is very serious about academic. I know that one. But what are some suggestions you want to? We have like many clubs, small groups, but I think that's not enough for me personally. So what are some suggestions you want to suggest us to making a good relationship within our school, between friends?
There are lots of ways that you can connect with friends. I'll share personally, when I was a student here at Fuller, I think the first quarter I was here, I played intramural basketball with a bunch of guys. And we started the practice. There were 5 of us, sort of the core guys who were interested in doing this. We started a practice of getting together once a week for dinner on Monday nights at McCormick and Schmidt's before it closed. It used to be over by California Pizza Kitchen. And we did that pretty much every Monday night for 3 years. And those guys became my best friends, not just during my time at Fuller, but then about a year later, one of them got married. We were all in California. We had moved different places. We were all in California for the wedding. We had a great weekend. We said, we got to keep this going. And so I think this spring we're going to get together for our 13th year in a row, just the 5 of us. We have like a 3-day retreat. We pray. We talk about, all these guys are pastors. I'm the one nerd who became an academic. But it's life-giving for me to hear them talk about their leading their churches, the ministry that they're doing. They love to hear about Fuller. So we just have, it's really the highlight of my year to connect with these friends. So, that's hard to create in some ways. But if you can try to develop those cohorts or those groups of friends that sustain you, not just during your time here at Fuller, but even beyond. And this would be my big piece of advice is, don't let your friendships fail after you leave here. When you move away from Pasadena, invest in them, continue them, and do things like set aside time to get together with people so that you can continue these long-term relationships. People you've known for a long time and who know you, they can really speak truth into your life if they've known you for a long time, as opposed to people you've known just for a few years.
There are a couple of actual formal things that are academic or required that can also facilitate some of these relationships. Within the School of Psychology, we have, as I mentioned before, a cohort-based model, so people go through. But along with that, we also have what's called integration groups, and we have labs, people organized in the doctoral program, organized around labs. And those relationships with your peers are, you're in proximity with them, you're struggling with some of the same issues, you're thinking about some of the same things. Within the SIS SOT degrees on the master's level, there's the integrative studies courses have with them formation groups that meet multiple times throughout the quarter. And there's variability in those groups and in how you interact with those people and what have you. But some of those groups are really fostering a lot of interchange, a lot of praying for each other, a lot of caring for each other in ways that can be deeply formative, both consistent with and different from the formal course learning outcomes for the groups, if you will.
I like what David said. I wish I had friends for 15 years. That's amazing. I think it's a great idea, though. You make a commitment to get together with somebody. But I think what Mary said is true. There are many opportunities that we make possible for you. And it's up to you then to continue those commitments, whether it be in a small group. My wife and I have led a small group here for 4 years, and honestly, the students that we know the best, that we still keep up with all around the world, have sat in our living room 8 or 10 times a term and had a meal, and we cried. And then when they graduated, their parents came, and we were like in loco parentis, and met their parents, and we said, "Oh, that's why she's like that," It was kind of full circle, And but also, I think that if you set aside the time and make that happen, those will be the places where you can let down your hair, you can cry, you can get angry, and so forth. But you really do need to make that a priority. The one final thing I would say is keep a Sabbath, and it's in the Bible, And you can't redact that out. I mean, that's just like rock solid. And God promises us, Jesus says, he promises a Sabbath rest. It's one of the greatest gifts. And I'll tell one final story. We had a student first year that we were introducing ourselves in our small group. And she says, well, the one thing have to know about me is that I just love Sabbath. Isn't that neat that God insists that we spend a whole day with him every week? I mean, isn't that amazing? And her roommate said, yeah, no, that's really true. She's crazy about Sabbath. That's really interesting. She would go up a mountain, hike up, and just take her Bible. And after worship, 4 hours or so every Sunday, just to spend time with God. And she thought, it's amazing that God insists that we do that every week. So it may be that you'll do some Sabbath rest with your friends or whatever, but if you really keep a Sabbath, you'll have time, for friends.
Thanks. One of the things I tell my doctoral students that I think relates not only to my doctoral students is it never gets any better. Sometimes my students will say, well, if I can just get through the next 4 years, then I can start having a life. Or if I just get through my dissertation, then I can spend time with my kids. Or if I just get through these courses, then I can start having coffee with friends. And of course, what happens after you finish those courses is there's now something else. After the dissertation, there's something else. After the job, there's something else. And so if you aren't putting down good habits today, there's no particular reason to expect it's going to happen in 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. Now is the time to try to work out balance. When I was in seminary, I actually did this in the context of a small group. I'm a Wesleyan, as I've already admitted. The Wesleyans have a group called a band. Do you know this language? Mm-hmm. So we met every Wednesday morning at 6 o'clock for 4 years. And we ask ourselves the same questions every single Wednesday morning. The questions from Wesley: what sins have you committed since we last met?
What's a guilty conscience?
What temptations have you met with? Mm-hmm. What have you thought, said, or done that you're not sure whether that's a sin, with the expectation that we'll tell you? And then are you desirous of holding anything back? Those are the 4 questions we ask. And the interesting thing is, we were all married, we were all full-time students, and we were all engaged in pastoral ministry. And so almost invariably, every week became a conversation around balance, about how you fulfilled your relationships, how you are faithful in these various circles, these various covenants, if you will, that we had. Really a critical time for me. And when we get together, we say to each other, what sins have you committed since we last met? It gets longer with the years. Well, thank you so much for the time that we've been able to share. I don't know exactly what's on the schedule.